Good evening, I'm Rachel Richards, I'm Beeline's Officer for Bug Life, and I'm going to talk about supporting pollinators and other invertebrates on farms. So this is my basic structure for the talk. Why are invertebrates important? Who are the pollinators? What do pollinators need on farms, most importantly? And then a little on beelines. So firstly, the value of invertebrates. So of course they have their own intrinsic value. We all love to see a meadow full of insects, our first bumblebee in the spring, but they also perform vital ecosystem services such as enhanced pollination services, integrated pest management, so that's having the right balance of the predatory invertebrates so that other species don't become pests. Of course, they're food for other wildlife. They're the base of the food chain. So if we want all those migratory swifts and swallows and house martins and warblers and things back on the farm, we need that abundance and diversity of invertebrates as well. And they also help to improve soil through things like nutrient recycling, water use efficiency, aeration of soil, things like worms and other invertebrates digging around in the soil, and therefore the need for less inputs. So who are our pollinators? So in the UK, we believe there's at least 4,000 species involved. So it's not just our bees. You know, everyone thinks about honeybees and bumblebees, solitary bees, even butterflies. But these images represent the main invertebrate groups that contribute to pollination. So you've got a hoverfly at the top there, representing all the flies. A solitary bee in the middle, so some of them are very small but generally quite messy pollinators, deliberately visiting flowers to collect pollen and then transferring some. Got the solitary wasps at the top, so wasps are generally predatory, but they're visiting flowers to feed. So again, they're picking up pollen and transporting it around. And some wasps, you know, things that are drawn into things like orchids can actually pollinate those as well. Butterflies and moths, we've got the bumblebee there in the middle, and then beetles. So all of these are visiting flowers and therefore transporting pollen. And if you go through a meadow on a sunny day, what you're actually most likely to see the most of is things like flies, things like the yellow dung fly that you often see on buttercups, covered in pollen. So, you know, the sheer abundance of those flies means that they are moving a lot of pollen around. So a little bit more on the pollinator army, the species we have in the UK. So around 270 bee species, over 2,000 butterflies and moths, over 6,700 flies, and over 4,000 species of beetles. So just a little bit more on some of the main pollinator groups. So bumblebees, we have around 24 species in the UK. They're quite big, they're quite long distance foragers, so they can travel 1 to 2 kilometres from their nest to forage. Having lots of forage near their nest is much better for them. They can be more successful with their foraging if they don't have to travel too far to find the next bit of food. They also do something called buzz pollination, whereby they use the vibration of their wing muscles to dislodge at a particular frequency, which then dislodges the pollen grains from plants which have co-evolved with them. So there are a number of plants, you know, things like tomatoes, kiwis, aubergines, broad beans, apples, that are important food crops that require this buzz pollination, which is only really carried out by bumblebees and some solitary bees. So just a little bit on the bumblebee life cycle so we can understand their habitat needs a little bit more. So in the spring, so around now, sort of February, March, even into April, bees are coming out of hibernation. So when the queen comes out of hibernation, she's hungry. She already has fertilized eggs in her growing, but she needs food, she needs nectar for energy, she needs pollen to keep growing her eggs. So willow is a really important spring plant. You can see this one here on willow. And she will start to look for a nest site, but also start to gather pollen. So you'll see a lot of bumblebees in the spring zigzagging around in the ground, looking for nest sites. A lot of them use small mammal holes others use tusky grasses. So these habitats are really important for bumblebee nesting sites. Through the spring, summer, they will lay more and more eggs, they will produce more and more young, which are the workers. So the workers are smaller versions of the queens, they're all females, but the queen is the one that's laying all the eggs in the nest there. And through the summer, if the weather isn't too bad and if there's suitable forage not too far from the nest will get bigger and bigger. So anything from 50 to maybe around 400 workers in a nest. Towards the end of the summer, the nest will produce new queens and males. The old queens and the workers will all start to die off, so a lot of dead bees will be found. That's quite natural. And the new queens will disperse and find males from other nests, hopefully, to mate with. And at the end of the summer, the winter, the mated queens then are looking for a hibernation site. And those hibernation sites tend to be shadier places. You know, they don't want the sunny areas where they were nesting in the summer, so they don't want to be waking up through the winter whenever there's a nice warm day. So all those habitats are really important for their life cycle. So the forage, nesting sites, and hibernation sites. So solitary bees, some images there of different types of solitary bees. We have around 250 species. They carry pollen quite loosely around the body, which makes them very good pollinators. They are either ground or aerial nesters. Aerial nesters being the ones that nest in holes in wood, beetle holes, hollow stems and the like, bee hotels. But many species will only travel very short distances, only sort of 100 or 200 meters. So having that connectivity of habitat is really important. Otherwise, you might have a beautiful little site, but if it's surrounded by uninhabitable habitat for the bees, they can't get there. And many of them have distinct seasonality. So the spring species, summer species, some that are later in the summer, some that are bivoltine, so they might have a spring and a later generation. They'll be coming out at the same time as the plants that they are feeding from. Again, some are very specialist, others are more generalist, but in the spring there's quite a few plants associated with spring blossom. So onto honeybees quickly. They're likely to originate, we believe, from Asia. They're much bigger than bumblebees. So we said 50 to 400 workers for bumblebees. This is 20 to 60,000 workers. And hence they're making the honey to keep them going over the winter months. They're efficient at collecting pollen, but not always as efficient at pollinating. That pollen, as you can see in the image there, is quite a hard, compact lump on the leg. So not as messy pollinators, not as spreading as much pollen perhaps. They can also compete with wild pollinators and spread disease, so it's something to be aware of. If you have SSSI habitat on your farm, I wouldn't encourage too many beehives, and it's just being aware of like the proximity of beehives to important semi-natural habitats so that you aren't creating too much competition with native pollinators. So this is from a paper from Garibaldi in 2013. Wild insects provide better quality pollination as a result of their foraging behaviour and enhanced fruit set regardless of honeybee abundance. So honeybees supplement wild insect pollination, but they can't replace it. So hoverflies, another major group, they are pollinators and the larvae in particular are predatory. So around 275 British species, and around 40% of them have larvae that are predators of aphids, scale insects and plant life. So, you know, a great thing to have on crops. So that's semi-natural habitat around crops to support aphids is really, to support not aphids, hoverflies is very important. So the marmalade hoverfly, that one just above my head, very easy to recognize, consumes, apparently someone has counted, 660 to 1,140 aphids during its development. So you want a lot of these. And a lot of these hoverflies are migratory, so they can get to the habitat if the habitat is there. So what do pollinators need, or pollinators? I've put connectivity first. So connectivity of flower-rich habitat across the landscape. Obviously they need that food supply, but if areas are not connected, a lot of pollinators cannot get there. And the continuous food supply is from spring through to autumn. So they found on a lot of farms it's autumn where there is a bit of a hunger gap there. Spring hedgerows are extremely important, so species-rich hedgerows and shrubs. If it's not hedgerows, just sort of shrubby areas are really important. And they also need shelter for breeding and overwintering, like we've spoken about. So nesting sites and overwintering sites. So, those tussocky, scruffy areas are really important as well. Bare soil areas for solitary bees. And they need a safe environment. So light pollution can be a really big issue. If there's too much lighting, it can affect migrating moths and the like. They're using the stars and the moon to orientate themselves. They can go off track. It can mean that they can't find mates as well if they're distracted with lighting, and it increases the predation. And then, of course, things like chemical pollution, so the use of herbicides and pesticides, etc. So what can farmers do? So managing important flower-rich habitats. So really value those flower-rich habitats that you have on farm. Use options like GS6, 7 and 8. They pay quite well now when we can get into them. And delay cutting until late summer. When you have those flower-rich areas, do try and allow them to flower. Use temporary fencing to protect sensitive areas. If you've got a patch of orchids in a wet corner of a field, is it possible to fence it off from grazing animals and let it flower longer? Things like mob grazing done in a way that always allows an area to flower is really beneficial. And those track sides, so quite often just the base of banks, the base of hedgerows, those little strips of native flowery habitat, if they can be managed better, so ideally with an annual cut and lift so that they can become more species rich rather than just more tussocky, that can really help. Okay, weedy field corners as well. So these unmanaged areas we were just talking about with things like teasels, ox tongue, willow herbs, umbellifers. A lot of these plants are loved by pollinators, and again, it's that tussocky overwintering habitat. And cut these areas, but every 2 or 3 years. If you have a corner, perhaps cut half of it one year, half of it another year, so you always have that slightly older habitat, but you're also creating clear areas where new plants can come in and be more flowery potentially. And weeds. So there's a paper by N. Balfour, 2022, on the disproportionate value of weeds for pollinators. And they actually found the abundance and diversity of pollinators visiting the weed species averaged twice that of the recommended plants in pollinator mixes. So these plants, although you don't want a whole field of thistles, for example, things like creeping thistle, spear thistle, marsh thistle is a lovely one, having small areas of this, not eliminating all of them, realizing their value for pollinators is very important. So tussocky grassland and ruderals provide shelter, feeding and nesting habitat for invertebrates. Okay, did I miss one? I don't think so. Okay, nectar mixes and flowering margins. So legume mixes are particularly good for bees, as you may well know. So in the same way that beans are very rich in protein for us, the pollen of legumes is very protein rich for bees and other pollinators as well. Red clover in particular. So wildflower margins are great for pollinators and good for filling that hunger gap as well. They're often left quite late into the summer when everything else has gone, so they're very valuable. But it's just doing things like trying to avoid, if you are spraying a neighbouring field, trying to avoid drift onto those habitats. We don't want these flowery areas sort of polluted, really. Hedgerows and trees, we've mentioned them already, managing again on a 2 to 3 year cycle, so they are allowed to flower and fruit. And having a diversity of different plants in there, so things like willow, blackthorn, hawthorn, damson, other fruits that are flowering. Obviously great food for pollinators and the fruits there for birds, etc. as well. And later in the year, things like sycamore and oak are also valuable to pollinators. So as much as anything, it's the honeydew produced by aphids that bees are feeding off. And often after a dry spell, if there's been a bit of rain and you walk under trees, you'll hear the buzzing in the canopy, and it's the sap rising and the aphids overfeeding, and the bumblebees are having a feast as well. Deadwood is very valuable, not so much to pollinators, but well, to wasps and beetles, etc. And different species will use it in the sun or in the shade. So in both those environments is good. And of course, as we all know, ponds, ditches, wetland habitats are really, really important for so many things, but particularly invertebrates. And you'll get different invertebrate assemblages in different conditions. And of course, that's where all your swifts and swallows and things will be feeding in the summer as well. That's where all the biomass of invertebrates is. And give a bee a home. So nesting habitat. You may already have nesting features on the farm. Solitary bees are some of our best pollinators, and a lot of them like bare ground and sunny banks. So these areas want to have a southerly, easterly or westerly aspect ideally. They won't really use the shadier northern banks. And these exposed areas of bare ground are used by nesting bees, beetles, wasps, all sorts of things, really important habitat. Many of these species, as I said, only forage very short distances. So again, these features within a flowery corner or at the side of a meadow or within some semi-natural habitat where there's also forage is really valuable. And these features are often not go unnoticed by farmers. This image here by next to a wall and a fence is just a little cutting beside a farm gate. And I pulled up at this farm to do an event and stopped at this cutting because it was covered in solitary bees and their cuckoo bees. There was all sorts of things nesting there, but I don't think it's something the farmer had noticed as an important habitat. So you may well have these features on the farm. It's good to find them, look after them, keep an eye on them, not drive the tractor over them. If the vegetation's growing up at the base, maybe cut that back so it stays open and sunny. That's really helpful. Or you can create these features like the guys you can see there at the top. And the slide below is a more established bee bank. And this was covered in butterflies and beetles and bees. They're great features to put in. And we've got guidance on that on our website. So what you can do on farm is an overall sort of habitat assessment, just considering the different factors I've mentioned above. So what's the connectivity of flower-rich habitat like on your farm? Have you got a couple of great meadows or some really nice corners or ponds? But are they connected to other areas? Are they connected to flower-rich habitat off-site and across-site? Hedgerows and margins obviously can be used to do that, but that connectivity is really important. Do you have a continuous food supply? Are the flowers on the farm across the year, including the hedgerows and things, of course? Do you have spring, summer and autumn or other hunger gaps you can try and fill somehow? Shelter, looking at nesting features like we've mentioned, and tussocky grass areas, woody features. And it's gone forward. The other last one there was safety. So to your use of chemicals and lighting on the farm. So last but not least, just a little bit on beelines. So beelines have been mapped across the UK, county by county. They're 3 kilometre wide corridors connecting some of the best remaining areas of flower-rich habitat. So the bigger sites are better where possible, so sort of 2 hectares or over have been calculated as a good area to support pollinator populations. And the aim is to make the landscape more permeable, sort of meaning that the stepping stones so that insects can move across the landscape rather than isolated patches with no movement. And it's a shared map, so this map is on our website, anybody can add to it. It's a way of directing and focusing flower-rich habitat creation across the UK in order to create more connectivity. As the State of Nature report identified, we need more, bigger, better and more connected areas for wildlife, and that's what Beelines is trying to do. So do please add your farm onto Beelines. This is just a zoom in of an area of beelines. You can find it on our website under Our Work, Beelines. Scroll down to the bottom of the page. There's an interactive map. You can zoom right in, find your farm, find your meadow, orchard, species-rich hedgerow, flowery wetland, any habitat that you believe is managed well for pollinators, avoiding the use of chemicals and allowing plants to flower through the year. Please do put those habitats onto the Beelines website. So you just click that Add Site button there in green, zoom in on your farm or garden or area, and you can put the details in there of the habitats on your farm, and it'll pop up as one of these little blue markers on the map so others can see what you're doing in your area, hopefully be inspired to do more themselves as well. So that's me, lovely. Thank you very much.